Hi guys, thanks for tuning in. This is Radio Visca. I just finished watching Manhunt Unabomber, which is a 8-part miniseries on Discovery Channel, I think it is, featuring Sam Worthington and I can't think of the the actor who plays Ted Kaczynski. It'll probably come to me. Paul Bettany. Paul Bettany. So it's Sam Worthington and Paul Bettany facing off against each other in what I thought was a fairly decent little mini-series. Nothing groundbreaking, but it definitely reminded me of Ted Kaczynski's writings and his ideas, and it just got me thinking about individualism versus collectivism, because I believe if we look at how society has been structured, the society we currently live in the West, I think one of the fundamental aspects, or one of the fundamental characteristics of our society is the absolute, utter lack of collectivism. And with collectivism, I don't mean a communist state-run, nationwide or global collectivism. I mean tribalism, really. I mean collectives organizing for their own interests together. Now, I don't mean to say that there are no collectives doing this. Now, there's certainly certain interest groups that have fairly strong in-group preference and organize. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the objective of the ruling class, the objective of the elite, is really to destroy all collective interest in the subject population. And you see that really in the West, that's pretty much completely, there's really there's no unified, strong groups advocating for anything really anymore in the West. You don't really even have unions anymore. Unions essentially can't do anything because they're co-opted and because they are going up against non-union workers within their industry, which are mainly foreign immigrants. It's quite sorry, there was a bat here. It's quite interesting for me to see whenever there's any kind of transport strike that there seems to be a certain, what did you call them, the scabs or the skebs or whatever, the strike breakers. Essentially, there seems to be a certain number of usually subcontinental Indians or Arabs that just continue working no matter who wants to strike, no matter what the industry. And this is, this is one of the main purposes of multiculturalism, in my opinion, is a sort of destruction of unified subject population which might rise up against the rulers. I think there's many reasons that multiculturalism is pushed by our current ruling elite, but that's a strong one, I would say. Now, if you look at our living arrangements, it's really in every aspect of society that any kind of collective identity, collective group formation is hindered. Any group formation that is not at least controlled or guided by the establishment. Now, there are obviously guided group formations. There's this false identity, there's false group formations. I would count the, sports, obviously, organized sports into that. And I would count nationalism as a false identity. I mean, the thing obviously today is that large parts of the establishment, in large parts of the world at least, have moved past nationalism because they really control more than one nation at this point. So the banking elite, they have lots of nations under their sway. So what they can only really use nationalism to control a global anti-financial awakening or group, but really, I mean, that's not really a huge danger. So I think, there's no use for nationalism for certain elites, but certainly I believe in the past, I would argue that nationalism was also a sort of false group formation in a way. Not in every case. I mean, there are small nations where Iceland, I would argue, probably nationality is a viable group identity, and there are other examples as well. But in many countries, even places like Germany or Sweden, nationality really, I would say, is only a part of what people's identity should be. Especially in Germany, if you have places like Bavaria and Saxony and northern Friesland and those kind of places, you really would have to admit that they're not really the same peoples. Fundamentally, they're all Europeans, they're all whites. But when fighting the rulers 100 years ago, really what would have mattered is identity as, a village, identity as a local rural population, identity as, proletarians, if one wants to use the Marxist terminology. Now, of course, we all know that the proletarian identity is also a fake identity. So, and I like this analogy of, I like this idea that, I can't remember where I've heard this before, though, that, really Marxism and neoliberalism are just two sides of the same coin. That, one side of the coin, you're a proletarian and you don't have any, ethnic or gender or, religious identity. You're just a proletarian, one of the workers, And then on the neoliberal side, you're just a consumer, you don't have any, you're gender neutral, you're deracinated, your religion, all of this doesn't matter. All you're supposed to do is consume and work and be a cog in the machine. So both of those identities atomize people really and destroy true collective identities. Now, true collective identities are things like race, like ethnicity, and this is why I earlier was a little bit counter-signaling against nationalism and nationality, because, as we know, nation is not the same as ethnicity. I mean, just look at places like Syria or Switzerland or even Belgium, So and in modern nations, in places like America, ethnicity and nation definitely aren't the same. So really, nationality and nationalism often does not coincide with a valid identity, in my opinion. But certainly race and ethnicity, I think, form fundamental biological building blocks of identity. One's ancestry, one's history, one's culture, one's gender, but first and foremost, one's family network. Your family relations, really, your blood relations. That's your number one identity. And again, we see in the West this extreme form of anti-family arrangement where you have increasingly many people that never marry, never have kids, have no brothers. They maybe themselves were single children, you know, and often with parents that waited quite long to have them, so die, you know, early in their life. So you have this extreme isolation, this extreme atomization of people in society, and adding to that is the sort of modern workplace or labor market, really, where you have people having to move from their families, having to move from their school and their village and their local just environment, and having to fit into these mega cities where, you know, they basically know nobody. Now, since we have a lack of offspring amongst native Westerners, there's now also this atomizing, well, there's this migration from the third world. Not only from the third world, there's also a lot from the ex-communist bloc, which I guess was the second world, but both from the, you know, ex-communist bloc and from the third world. And obviously migration in itself has a destructive, well, I can tell you from experience, it has a hugely destructive impact on family relations and on your social environment, your social integration in you know, your ancestry, your identity, essentially, as part of a collective. Collectives get smashed through migration. Non-government, non-elite collectives, that is. Now, there are certain ethnicities that have a sort of cosmopolitan identity, you know, the Jews, for example. So it's not always the case that, and the Chinese, I think you could probably count in this as well. I mean, they have a sort of global, you know, Chinatowns everywhere kind of thing. But nevertheless, I think in those identities there also is, you know, deleterious effects of the modern society. So, but for the average Joe, you know, whether he's from the Ukraine or from Italy or, you know, from Ireland, I mean, apart from some superficial cultural things that they can find in a new country, you know, the Irishman finding an Irish pub in Australia, or the Italian, you know, finding a lot of, you know, people with Italian ancestry in New York, or the Ukrainian, you know, finding a Ukrainian sort of corner store in London. These are, you know, superficial things. They don't really aid in establishing a collective. These migratory collectives are generally strongly weakened. They exist often at the bottom of the social ladder in the new societies, in these new colony societies. And in Europe, the same is happening. Europe is essentially being transformed into the modern Canadian, American, Australian society. England's already pretty much there. Because I believe the financial elite is American, and they've built their national passport might be American. Let's say that. Let's put it that way. And they've built their system of control in the American way, and so it makes sense that, you know, as Rome built colosseums and aqueducts in all nations it's controlled, well, America is creating multiculturalism in all nations it controls, save in South Korea and Japan at this point in time. So I would say for the migrants that come to Europe, even though they might come from more socially intact cultures, from regions of the planet where, you know, there's still villages and there's still normal sort of family structures, and they have large families still, the act of migration will cause damage to their collective identity as well. And often, you know, when you have these new arrivals in Europe, they're usually men, and they're usually, you know, 18 and above or 16 and above. So they're kind of coming as isolated, atomized people as well. On their journey, they've often met a lot of people that, are not from their immediate language, nation even, or nation of origin. They do form sort of temporary allegiances in these, but then again, they do get dispersed across Europe as well, and the same in America. So these temporary allegiances, they probably form a lot of friendships that do get dispersed as well and broken up through the process of resettlement. And I guess then in these new nations that they live in, they then quickly form this sort of, often religious communities. And it's interesting to see that religion actually does take on a stronger meaning for a lot of migrants, or their children at least. I believe, people in Morocco and people in Iraq, and I think Islam is important in many of these nations, but I think it becomes more important in people's lives once they are in Europe, because any other identity is torn from them. Their village, their family, their nationality, their friendship circles, right? Really, these standard, as with Westerners, the migrants also have strong identity-destructing influences on them. However, they are still very strongly, in most cases with Muslims at least, under the sway of Islam. And I think with Hindus it's pretty similar, and Sikhs as well. Unlike Westerners who have basically, by and large, given up on Christianity. And by the way, I think that's a good thing. I think Christianity is a shockingly bad religion and has had absolutely shocking effects on Europe. But that aside, Europeans don't even have that identity anymore, and to kind of give them some belonging and some social connectivity, right? So, in many cases, the migrants do end up having a collectively and socially superior social field to the natives in these, Western postmodern societies. And you see that especially in larger cities, that's the case. I would say in the countryside, there's still obviously Westerners that still do have their social, that have lived there for generations and have, they're sort of integrated there. But in larger cities, a white person who's moved there from another European country, I would argue, is often from a social health point of view disadvantaged compared to Muslims, for example, and Chinese, I'd say as well. And part of this is simply the Western sort of degenerate lifestyle, where it's all about drugs and trance and gay pride parades and alcohol and avoiding family and pregnancy as much as you can, right? It's not only these tendencies have been promoted by the establishment. This is clear. You see this in the media, in movies, in just funding. In the arts and media funding. Sorry, it's my alarm here. But I don't think all of it is sort of conspiracy based. I think there's a sort of natural progression to a wealthy society as well, and maybe some stupidity, right? It's not that hard to figure out that if you don't have kids, and if everyone around you is not having kids, what's going to happen, right? Especially when you get older, right? The welfare state here is also to blame, right? So it's not. There's a sort of a sense of the degeneracy being kind of caused by the baby boomers' wealth and their sort of luxury almost. So it's not. I think there's influences that push things over the line in terms of degeneracy. That's a contentious word, but I think it's apt when you look at things like abortion and obesity. I mean, that is degenerate in a biological sense, right? Killing your own offspring. I mean, which animals do that? I mean, that's crazy, really, as a life form. I mean, I'm sure there are some animals that sometimes do that, but I think certainly the Western man, Western woman actually, is in that respect, in the respect of killing its own offspring, is the craziest life form that currently exists. I mean, it's a completely degenerate evolutionary trait from a survival point of view. So, circling back to the Unabomber manhunt series and Ted Kaczynski's writings, I mean, I think there's also an aspect of just technology and regimentation and, the Prussian educational model, the sort of systemization and organizational regimentation of society that causes some of these things as well. Like, there's simply certain requirements to keep the machine running. The machine being modern Western economies and industrial society. So that there's not only malice maybe in the sort of establishment's social engineering. There may also be a certain sort of just fait accompli, a sort of, well, this is what's necessary. Well, we need someone to, pilot the plane on time. We need the bus driver to show up on time. The train has to arrive every day. I mean, the power plant has to be maintained, otherwise the power grid goes down. I mean, there's a certain just cog in the machine kind of like necessity for humans to be atomized units of action in modern society. And people are educated and brainwashed really accordingly to, and so that has this sort of, from a biological evolutionary point of view, it obviously has this terrible effect on a species' survival and procreation, as we see not only in white countries but also in Japan and South Korea to some degree as well. So this lack of babies is not a purely white thing. It's a modernized thing. It's a modern society thing. It's a industrial society thing. It's a phenomena where people work too hard to even have sex. Where people work so hard they don't even meet any women. I mean, where everyone's kind of expectations of wealth and their real ability to gain wealth are so divergent that, and this is sort of the carrot that is dangled in front of everyone. There's sort of the Ferrari on TV that everyone thinks they can have, but nobody will have. And because everyone thinks they will have it, everyone expects everyone to have it, and if you don't have it, well, you're not good enough for me, kind of thing, right? This is sort of keeping up with the Joneses kind of effect. I mean, look, the industrial society is not the only thing. Pornography, I think, is a huge one. But then again, pornography is enabled by industrial society. And in a way, it's a sort of management tool for industrial society as well, right? I mean, imagine guys would have to work next to very attractive young women in a sort of office environment, and they never had access to any kind of pornography. And so I think the sort of the concentration levels would be a lot lower, So, you could argue that much of, what we call sort of brainwashing or elite indoctrination tools, it may just be sort of like necessities to keep modern society running. I mean, that's Ted Kaczynski's point of view, right? Now, the other way of looking at that is modern industrial society is only set up for certain, ruling elites' benefits. So the only reason it exists is actually to increase productivity and funnel more wealth up the pyramid, so to speak. And I think both are true. I think it doesn't have to be one or the other. So, what does that mean? I mean, why did I start thinking about this? Well, I think it really what strikes me is just the incredible impoverishment of modern life. I mean, what does it mean to be human these days? I mean, most of our experiences are just on TV. I mean, the average person doesn't have any experiences, like any real experiences. They may travel every now and then, which is a form of experience, but what is that travel really? It's getting on a plane, flying somewhere for a week or two, and flying back, right? So, yes, you have people, doing the backpacking, but all of that backpacking is a sort of consumerist activity as well, when you really think about it, right? Because you're not really building a traditional sort of meaningful life as a human in a family, in a tribe, in a society, with ancestors and offspring, right? You're just wasting your money being a stranger everywhere you go. I mean, I don't want to totally counter-signal traveling, and it definitely opens your eyes, but I think for the most part it's a sort of fairly wasteful activity, and especially when women do it. I mean, I think there's this phenomenon of all these like 35-year-old women that still want to travel every year. They just have no kids and they just save money to go like travel every summer, and it's just sad, and by the time they're 40, I mean, that's it. Their genetic line is done. They've basically brought themselves out of the gene pool, but for what reason, I mean, that's what gets to me, just if you look at us as a biological life form, as an animal, then and if you judge an animal's success by its procreation, it's basically its function as an animal, which is survival and nurturing offspring, right? Its own reproduction. If you judge the Western human by the standard criteria of any living life form, I mean, our society is killing us. Our society is genociding us. And there's no, I mean, I'm not saying this is going to continue forever until we're zero. I think, this won't last forever. But it's possible that, we will become a minority as whites, the same as, Native Americans or Jews, or at least that our strength in the world will mirror that, our society, that of, the Mayas and the Aztecs, which I guess they didn't get wiped out, but their civilization was taken over by Spanish and still is essentially ruled by Iberians, for the most part, or I guess Anglo-Saxons at this point in time. So in New Mexico, etc., Texas. So while they may have escaped, the fate of North American Native Indians, which were almost wiped out, they still had their civilization wiped out. And I guess they have been recovering for the most part as well. I mean, I don't know how far down the numbers of Central American Indians and South American Indians went before their numbers started going up again with modern technology and medicine, but I mean, I get this impression that Mexicans never completely were wiped out in any way, that there was just a sort of large rural population. No, I might be wrong, I don't know enough, but certainly now, the sort of mainly Native American stock of Mexicans has recuperated, right? So, I guess this is sort of the distant white pill that even if we go, our populations drop as Western civilization crashes, well, we might come back, sort of thing, But this is, that's no way to plan a future. So, I mean, I think we really need to be looking at what's happening now. And what's happening now is that our ideology, combined with the world situation, combined with the industrial society, is all and combined with our elites who are clearly behind a lot of this. I mean, the problems have been known for 30, 40 years. I mean, the fact that feminism means less kids, I think that's, you don't have to be a genius, you don't have to wait 40 years to find that out. You know, that's known immediately after 10, 20 years with statistics, you know. So they're clearly behind this as well. They're clearly egging this on for whatever reasons. You know, I mean, I won't go into this in this video because I want to keep this video mainly focused on the problem, the symptom, so to speak. You know, not necessarily the causes too much. If we talk about intentional causes of, you know, rulers. So I think what's needed really is one of those three elements, or two of those three elements at least, need to change. I mean, it's possible that all three elements change. You know, the rulers get kicked out, technological society collapses, and our ideology changes. Well, I mean, really, if you kick two out, the third will just change by automatically, really, right? I mean, if our ideology changes and our rulers get kicked out, well, gee, technological society could maybe survive. But certainly in any other configuration, I think we're looking at a complete collapse, right? I mean, if technological society goes, then it's very unlikely that our rulers or our ideology will stay. So, you know, there's our scenarios that we need to think about, right? And I think probably the technological collapse is the least feasible, right? It's the most cataclysmic. I mean, it's certainly easier to, well, should at least be easier to change your rulers and to change your ideology rather than go back to a society where none of the infrastructure that we currently have works anymore. I mean, that is maybe from a biological point of view the best option, because that might, initially at least, it will cause a die-off, but that die-off might actually be much stronger, you know, from our European point of view amongst other subspecies of the human species. And, you know, to anyone who gets triggered by that, just put a Ethiopian next to you know, a Eskimo and tell me that they are exactly the same species. I mean, that's just absurd. You know, I mean, just millions of insects and birds that are much more similar to each other and categorized into different species, right? So, I think that kind of is all I wanted to say today. Really, just something that came to mind and just some musing here. It's been a long time since I've posted, so I thought I'd just get something up there again. There's been a lot of stuff going on in my life, so I haven't, you know, had time to post too much. If you like what I had to say, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, just leave them in the section below, and I'll talk to you soon.